A quiet boy from a simple family is publicly humiliated at an elite school for his background. He takes the blow in silence, but the next day a man whose name even those who don't follow the news know arrives at school. Everything that seemed stable begins to crack, and the masks fall off their faces one by one. This is a story about dignity that doesn't scream, but stands, firmly, like the ground beneath your feet. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories. The auditorium of the history department at Windenborg Academy, awash in marble, glass, and subdued severity, was cool and dry. The light from the panoramic windows fell on the floor in even stripes, emphasizing the geometry of the space, in which there seemed to be no chance. Here, every gesture was measured, every silence was controlled. The students sat at dark wooden desks, lined up in perfect order, leafing through their tablets, preparing for another lecture on the history of Western civilization. Some lazily, others with deliberate concentration. And only one of them sat with hands roughened by physical labor and a real paper notebook on his desk. Ethan Gray. They sat him by the window, away from the spotlight, closer to the light. He was used to being on the sidelines, not because he wanted to hide, but because it was easier to breathe. He was different at this school, not because he wanted to be special, but because he couldn't be like the others. The others were ties, patent leather shoes, the faint perfume of their fathers lingering on their collars. The others were the children of those whose names were on the list of trustees. And he was a son of the soil. He rose at 5 a.m. to help his grandfather load sacks, then rode the bus for over an hour to get to Windenborg. His shoes were polished, but still rough. His clothes were clean, but not designer. He smelled of wood and hay and unscented soap. It was irritating. Today's topic was the fall of the Roman Republic. Mrs. Vanderlei, a tall, angular woman with cold eyes, considered herself an expert not only on antiquity, but also on human types. She believed in intelligence, but only in a packaged form. For her, intelligence was elegant, restrained, glossy. Ethan was repulsive to her. He was a living refutation of her system. He did not argue, but he did not assent either. He did everything on time, but did not ask for recognition. This was the most annoying thing. "Gray," she said, turning sharply to his row, "can you explain why the Roman Republic, despite the development of law and institutions, collapsed?" Ethan looked at her calmly. He knew the answer. He had read it the day before. He thought about it. And quietly said, "Because those who had power decided they could bend the rules, and those who didn't got tired of obeying." Some of the students chuckled. Some raised their eyebrows in surprise. The answer was accurate, but not what Vanderlei wanted to hear. "It's quite rustic," she commented, smiling reservedly. "You mean to say, Ethan, that it's like a farm? If a rooster pecks the henhouse collapses?" The class laughed. Ethan didn't laugh. He didn't answer. He just looked at her longer than usual. His gaze wasn't cocky, just direct. And there was something about that gaze that made her stumble a little. "Thank you for your opinion," she said, turning to the screen. "But next time, try to rely on sources, not on rural philosophy." Oliver Blackwood, the son of a famous lawyer, immediately turned to his friends and whispered, "Gray, instead of Cicero, reads the weather from manure." More laughter. Someone giggled into their hand. Ethan listened, didn't react. His shoulders remained straight. He just kept writing in his notebook, strictly, carefully. The letters were straight, firm, like his steps on the morning earth. Everything inside him clenched, not from shame, but from anger. But not the kind that screams, the kind that waits for the moment. After class, he was the first one out of the classroom. He walked down the hall until he stopped at the window. He gave himself a few seconds to just breathe. Then he walked out of the building, across the courtyard, and sat down on the edge of the fountain. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, where he kept a small folding knife, not as a weapon, but as a keepsake. He had carved his name into the farm fence with this knife when he was 9. His grandfather had said, "Don't disgrace your name. It will live in the tree longer than you do." That day he returned home in silence. In the evening he and his grandfather were stacking bales of hay. Ethan worked smoothly and quickly. His grandfather, standing at the gate, watched him pull the rope and finally said, "At school?" "Yes." "Who?" "The teacher, and the others, because I'm not like them." Grandfather took off his gloves. He came up to me and put his hand on my shoulder. "Respect doesn't come by asking. It comes by standing on your feet, not on your knees. Don't say yes, and don't stoop. They want you to be small, because they're afraid you're big." Ethan looked at him. The man never spoke of feelings, but there was a strength in his voice now, enough to make Ethan sit up straight. Later, when it got dark, the grandfather entered the house. He took the phone. He dialed the number. "This is Edward Gray. I have a request. No, a solution. Fly out tomorrow morning. To Vindenborg. We need to remind people who we are, and what they pay for." Ethan was sitting by the window at the time. He didn't hear the words, but he saw his grandfather speaking. And he felt tomorrow would be another day. Not because someone would give him a gift, but because the truth would come to light. And this time, it would sound loud and clear. The next morning, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. The dawn outside was milky gray, and everything around him seemed motionless, as if nature itself had momentarily held its breath. He lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His body already knew it was time to get up. It lived according to a schedule set not by the school bell, but by the earth, the sun, and how much time he had to get done before the end of the world. He pulled on an old sweatshirt, pulled on work jeans, threw on a jacket, and went down the stairs, trying not to make any noise. His grandfather was still asleep. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's bread and coffee that had cooled in a thermos. He poured himself some, sat down at the table, picked up a notebook. Not a school one, a personal one. There were short notes, reflections, lines he wrote at night. Sometimes about plants, sometimes about people. Today he opened a blank page and wrote, "Silence is not weakness, it's the roots. Deeper means stronger." At school, Ethan walked into the building the same way he always did, not hiding, but not seeking attention either. Only today, the glances that had previously slid past began to linger. Someone, from Oliver's class, whispered something as he entered. Someone simply looked away. In the hallway, he heard, "Gray, he's probably uncomfortable after yesterday." He didn't answer. He didn't slow down. He walked as straight as always. Only inside, something wasn't trembling anymore. In the first lesson, physics, the teacher, Mr. Collins, a man with glasses, a tie that was always askew and a warmth in his voice, noted, "Gray, good solution to the homework. Not quite standard, but right on point. Have you thought about the technical modeling club?" Ethan looked up slightly. "I'll think about it, sir. Think about it. It requires hands that understand matter. You have them." Ethan nodded. It was the first time in months that one of his teachers had said anything other than fine or acceptable, but something to the point. He made a mental note. Mr. Collins might be seeing. After class, he went to the library as usual. It was quiet. He picked up a book on political philosophy, the one Mrs. Vanderlei had mentioned last week. Cicero. On the Republic. He didn't want to prove anything to her, he just wanted to know for himself. He sat down in the corner between the sections and began to read slowly, line by line, writing down phrases in his notebook that resonated. True dignity is born not in rank, but in deeds. Later that day, during recess, he was approached by Mark, one of the few neutral students who had never participated in bullying, but also did not side with those who were bullied. "Listen," he began, shifting from side to side. "About yesterday. It was tough. I thought you were going to lose it. Ethan shrugged. For what? Well, I would probably throw something back. I can endure it better. You don't have to throw a stone. It gets heavier in the hands of the one who holds it. Mark froze for a moment, then nodded. You said it strongly. After school, Ethan went home again, but this time on the bus, his seat was next to a girl from a parallel class. She didn't say anything at first. She sat there, leafing through a comic book. And then suddenly she turned around. I was at your history lecture last week, about the peasant movement. You spoke well, confidently. Ethan was a little surprised. Thank you. You probably think it's all about brands and money. But you know, some of us are interested in what you know. He didn't answer, he just nodded. But something like warmth slowly ignited inside him. At home, in the evening, he worked with his grandfather again. They unloaded boxes of seedlings into the greenhouse, adjusted the netting on the beds. The work was familiar, almost meditative. Ethan was silent. So was his grandfather. And then, at the porch, his grandfather stopped and said, My partners will arrive at school tomorrow. Ethan looked at him. Who? Whoever needs to be. Don't worry, just be yourself. I have to remind their teachers of something. Is it because of yesterday? Not only. This is for you, because you didn't give up, and because a school that lives off the land has no right to despise the one who holds that land. Ethan was silent. He felt both grateful and anxious. He didn't want his grandfather to sort it out for him, but he knew this conversation had gone beyond one lesson. It was about more now, about the right to be. He couldn't sleep at night. He lay there, listening to the raindrops trickling down the roof, and thought about the sound of respect. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It lives in actions, in silence, behind which lies strength. And if tomorrow something changes, he will meet it calmly, not because he is ready, but because he is no longer afraid to be himself. The morning began as usual, with the indifferent ringing of the school bell, a damp wind from the north, and the usual bustle in the hall of Vindenborg Academy. Students were streaming into the building from different directions, some with a driver, some from a private parking lot, some on foot, in expensive sneakers, with leather briefcases and electronic tablets. Everything was flowing according to routine. Everything seemed stable, until the moment when he appeared in the sky. At first, no one knew where the vibration was coming from, a low hum, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Then someone pointed skyward, and heads began to turn. A helicopter was hovering over the school stadium, large, sleek, with a logo that some recognized immediately. 3 intersecting ears of grain on a green background. It was the symbol of Gray Harvest, a leader in agtech, owner of vast lands and equally vast financial assets. Those who followed business news knew that the symbol represented more than just money. It represented power from the land, power that was underestimated. The helicopter hovered over the field for a few seconds, then began to descend. The school staff ran out into the street, trying to figure out who it was and why without warning. The teachers on the upper floor pressed themselves to the windows. The students poured out onto the steps. The helicopter landed, and a tall, elderly man in a light coat stepped out, accompanied by 2 people, an assistant and a security guard. His movements were confident, like a man who was not used to asking permission. He did not smile, did not look around. He simply walked forward, towards the school. Is this someone important? One of the students whispered. That's Edward Gray, Mr. Collins said tightly, seeing the coated figure. Founder of Gray Harvest, one of our foundation's largest donors. A murmur ran through the school. Students were drawn closer. And some, on the contrary, began to feel awkwardness rising inside. Those who had laughed at Ethan yesterday suddenly felt that he was not so simple, but that was not yet clear. One thing was clear. The man walking down the hallway now had not arrived by chance. Edward Gray entered the building without registration, without a guard in front. They let him in without a word. He approached the administrators and said calmly, "Where is the history lesson for 11B taking place now?" On the second floor, in room 207, the woman behind the counter muttered. He nodded and went there. The guards remained at the entrance. Room 207. Mrs. Vanderlei was reporting on the fall of Carthage. Her voice was as clear, confident, and precise as ever. Ethan sat in his seat, taking notes. He didn't know what was going on outside. He just felt something building in his chest, not worry, not hope, just readiness for change. The classroom door opened. Everyone turned. Mrs. Vanderlei stopped mid-sentence and froze. "Sorry to bother you," Edward said as he walked in. "It'll only take me a couple of minutes." She tried to get her voice back. "Sorry, but we have a class now." "And that's why I'm here," he said calmly. "My grandson, Ethan Gray, was humiliated in this class yesterday, directly, in front of everyone, and I think the lesson is worth continuing, but in a different way." The silence was so thick that you could hear water dripping from the radiator by the window. "Excuse me," Mrs. Vanderlei began. "I'm not sure I understand what you're talking about." "Then let me remind you. You questioned his ability to think, his right to knowledge. You decided that dirt under his fingernails was a marker of intelligence, that if your hands were used to the shovel, your head didn't deserve Plutarch. Well, madam, I built an empire because I knew the smell of the earth. I financed this college. I'm the one who provided you with your history lab. But that's not even the point." He took a step forward, his voice lower but stronger. "The thing is, you've forgotten that intelligence isn't measured by vocabulary. That respect isn't a privilege, it's a norm. And when you look at a boy and see only his shoes, you've missed not only him, but the very essence of education." Mrs. Vanderlei looked down. For the first time in a long time, she had no answer. The class sat motionless. Even Oliver Blackwood did not grin. Even Chloe Breen did not text. Edward walked up to Ethan and put his hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not because you're my grandson, but because you didn't get smaller, even when they tried to make you smaller." He turned to the class. "I'm not asking you to love him. I'm asking only one thing. Remember who's speaking when you speak silently." He nodded and left, with the same calm with which he entered. When the door closed, almost half a minute passed before anyone drew breath. Mrs. Vanderlei stood at the board, still silent. Then she said, "Let's continue." But the lesson was already over. The real one sounded in a different voice, and everyone understood it. An unusual silence reigned in the classroom for a long time after Edward Gray had left. Even when Mrs. Vanderlei pretended to return to her lecture, her voice sounded different. The harshness had been replaced by a strained calm, as if each word was measured with an inner effort. The students glanced at each other, but almost no one whispered. There were plenty of glances, but there was no longer mockery in them. Rather, there was an appraising respect and a disturbed inner balance. Everyone seemed to think for the first time. Who else were they used to not noticing? Ethan sat in his seat, his back straight, his hands empty, pen still closed, notebook untouched. He didn't write. He didn't take notes. He just listened. Not to Vanderlei, to himself. The world around him suddenly felt different. It didn't feel lighter. It didn't feel kinder. But for the first time, it spoke. And that was enough. When the bell rang, the students filed out of the classroom faster than usual. They all walked in silence. Some glanced furtively at Ethan, others at the space by the teacher's desk that now seemed too big for Vanderlei. She remained at the board, her papers neatly stacked, her eyes downcast. Ethan was the last to stand. He walked to the door, stopped, and turned around. Their eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't judge. He simply nodded and walked out. The next few days at school felt like they had been painted over with a different light. Ethan noticed students giving him their seats in the cafeteria. Not demonstratively, just differently. Some came up to him during breaks. One of them, Joel, from a parallel class, said, "Your grandfather was strong, but you're even stronger, because you kept quiet and didn't cave in." Ethan shrugged. "I don't see the point in arguing with those who won't listen anyway. It's better to wait until they want to hear it themselves." "Now we've heard," Joel said, and left. Some students started asking questions, wanting to know where he lived, what he did in his free time. Some did it sincerely, some out of curiosity, some out of a desire to fix something inside themselves. But Ethan didn't hold a grudge against anyone. He accepted it as it was, not as a victory, but as a balance that had finally arrived. During the next history lesson, Mrs. Vanderlei entered the classroom a little later than usual. She had a piece of paper in her hands. She placed it on the table without looking at the students, and looking up said, "Before we begin, I want to say a few words." The audience fell silent. They even breathed more quietly. "Last week I made a mistake. I allowed myself to judge a person by their appearance. It goes against everything I was supposed to teach you. I allowed myself to be ironic where I should have been respectful. And today, I want to apologize to you, class." She turned her gaze to Ethan. "And to you, Ethan. I was wrong." The silence thickened, and then someone began to applaud slowly, then others. Soon, the whole class was clapping. Not boisterously, not theatrically, just humanly. Ethan didn't stand or bow. He just said, "Thank you, Miss Vanderlei. I don't need special treatment. Honest treatment is enough." From that day on, history lessons were no longer a battlefield for him. He answered questions. He asked his own. He still sat by the window, but now the students turned to him themselves and listened. One day, a week later, during an after-hours meeting, Oliver Blackwood approached Ethan. He looked tense. His face, usually filled with smug relaxation, was now focused. "I said stupid things about you," he began, "because I didn't know who you were, and I thought I did. I thought I knew what an important person was. I was wrong. So, if it matters to you, I'm sorry." Ethan looked at him calmly. "I don't hold a grudge. I just want you to think with more than just your eyes next time." Oliver nodded. "I've already started." Day after day, Ethan grew stronger in his new status. Not as popular, but as respected. Respect didn't elevate him above others. It made him equal. Exactly what he wanted from the very beginning. Not to be pitied, not to be praised without reason, just to be accepted. The debate club elected him as the moderator of one of the school meetings. He didn't ask. He simply raised his hand one day and proposed the topic. Silence as a form of action. When silence speaks louder than words. Everyone voted yes. In the evening, when Ethan returned home, his grandfather was already sitting on the veranda. In his hands was a book. On the table was a cup of cold tea. "Well?" he asked without looking up. "Everything is changing," Ethan said. "Slowly, but changing." Grandfather put the book aside. "The most important thing is not to forget how to be yourself, even when people around you start saying that you are now different." "I won't," Ethan chuckled. "I have a reminder. There's still dirt under my fingernails. And that's where the power lies." They sat in silence, listening to the evening. Ethan felt that the world had begun to hear his voice, but most importantly, he could now hear himself, and that was everything. The sun sank slowly behind the tree line, painting the sky above the farm a rich golden orange. The air was crisp with autumn, and the ground beneath his feet held the lingering warmth of the day. Ethan walked back from the fields, gloves tucked into his belt, boots covered in dust, an empty vegetable crate in his hands. The work was as familiar as breathing. And each step he took up the beaten path toward the house was steady, sure, as if a continuation of all the steps that had brought him to this moment. He didn't need to hurry. It was all done. After everything that had happened at school, the days had changed. He was no longer that Ethan. He was just Ethan. The guy who was no longer judged by the way he dressed or the way his hands were calloused. The guy who was no longer the subject of gossip, but an example, albeit a quiet one. His name was no longer spoken with mockery. Now, when it was spoken, there was seriousness in the voices, respect even. But he was not proud. He was the same. Because all that had changed was that those around him finally saw in him what he had always known about himself. School days went by at their own pace. Ethan participated in discussions, asked questions in class, answered when he knew, kept quiet when he had to. He was gone more than before, but also less. One day, after a discussion of the Enlightenment, Mrs. Vanderlei came up to him and said, "Your words on the subject of equality, they were precise. I am grateful to you." He nodded. "Thank you. I was just saying what I thought." She smiled, awkwardly, humanly. He didn't seek rapprochement, but he didn't push away either. He understood. Apologies, changes. This is also work, and not everyone goes through it quickly. But if a person has started, this is already the way. Grandpa, in his usual manner, didn't say much about the changes in his grandson's life. But Ethan noticed. In the newspapers he read in the morning, articles about education, about ethics, about the meaning of leadership were increasingly bookmarked. One day, Ethan found a speech paper in his grandfather's drawer. It was handwritten. "True power is the ability to listen. Strength is not power, but the respect you do not demand, but inspire." The school was preparing for its annual conference. Each senior had to choose a topic for a presentation, which was judged by the school board, teachers, and parents. Ethan had never raised his hand at these meetings before. He preferred to stay in the background, but this time he walked up to Mr. Collins and said, "I would like to speak. On the topic, Roots and Crowns, How the Land Teaches Us to Think. About what I have learned while living and working on a farm." Collins nodded, something warm in his gaze. "Excellent choice. It will be powerful. Just speak for yourself. Don't try to sound like someone else." Ethan nodded. He hadn't intended to. On the day of the speech, almost everyone gathered in the assembly hall. Students, teachers, several parents. Ethan came out on stage without papers, without slides, only with a microphone. He stood in his usual clothes, a shirt, worn trousers, shoes, and he began to speak. "I was born on a farm. Since childhood, I knew how the morning smells after rain, how the earth sounds when you step on it barefoot. I knew how the grass dies in the heat and how it comes back to life after the first frost. It took me a while to realize that all this is also knowledge." He spoke calmly, quietly, but every word echoed throughout the room. "I was taught that work is not a punishment. It is a language. And if you can hear it, you begin to understand not only plants but people too. I came to this school, and they showed me that I was a stranger here, not directly. They just looked through me. I was angry, but I didn't argue. I waited, and now I have waited. Because the truth, if you don't throw it in your face, will still get through. Through silence, through work, through action." The hall was silent. Even breathing was restrained. He continued, "I don't want us to be judged by our clothes, our last name, or what bank account our parents have. I want us to be listened to. Because everyone sitting here is a voice. And if one voice can change perception, let it be mine. Thank you." When he finished, the room was silent for a few seconds. And then the applause rose, unforced, unpretentious, sincere. The students stood up, even the teachers, even Vanderlei. And in the front row sat his grandfather. Straight-backed in his dark coat. He didn't clap loudly. He just watched. His face was still, but in his eyes, there was pride, real, quiet, just like Ethan's. Later in the hallway, many people shook Ethan's hand. Some simply nodded. Some said, "Thank you." He didn't catch the words. He knew they weren't the important thing. The important thing was that no one would ask why he had calluses on his palms anymore, because it wasn't something wrong anymore. It was a part of him, visible, respected, acknowledged. In the evening, already at home, he went out onto the porch. He had a cup of hot tea in his hands. The sky above the fields was dark and starry. Grandfather followed him out. He was silent. And then he said, I listened and thought, "You have become a person I would like to respect, even if you were a stranger to me." Ethan looked up at the sky. "Thank you, Grandpa, but everything I said is what you taught me." "No," the old man answered quietly. "I only showed you the way, and you chose how to walk along it." They stood side by side, 2 generations, 2 views, 1 route. Ethan knew everything was ahead. University, life, a world where you have to prove yourself over and over again. But he was ready, because now he knew for sure, if your roots are deep, no wind can tear you out of the earth.